In our darkest moments, sometimes all we can do is hope for a light. When we are in the midst of our darkness, often we just merely seek a way out. This may come in the form of a solution, a resolution, an outcome. There is the possibility we might not like the cold and uncomfortable truth that escorts us to this outcome. How must it be then to see those we love struggle, only to have their worst case scenario realized and then discover it could have been different? If only something instead of nothing was done. If only those charged with protecting the vulnerable actioned this responsibility when the opportunity arose. A tiny word with such a huge impact. If. And impact is the key element here. The impact that doing something may have had as opposed to the tragic impact that doing nothing proved to be. We investigate the impact of something versus nothing as we conclude the Hillier triple murder here on the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville, or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome again to Just Lawful, where indeed things do go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and I am, of course, once again joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster. A huge thank you to everyone listening. Again, if you haven't heard the previous episodes of this series, we strongly recommend that you go back to iTunes or Spotify. Please rate us, subscribe, and then catch up on where we are with this story as we start to, I think, finally, possibly wind down and get to a conclusion in this story of the Hillier triple murder. Before we begin, once again, obviously, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, please be advised that the following program does contain the names and references to people who have died. As always, if you find anything we've discussed distressing, please make use of the following support resources: the Victim Support Service on 8231 5626 or 1800 182 368, the Domestic Violence Crisis Service on 1300 782 200, the Domestic Violence Gateway Service on 1800 800 098, and the National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service on 1-800-RESPECT. As we step into this episode, Sean, I'm just going to go back half a step. We finished last episode by talking about finally getting a 36-year sentence, a non-parole period sentence for Stephen Pete. We also talked about the fact that there is one person absent from this, and there is also one party that needs to still be held to account. That's where I want to pick up from here. Where do you want to start with this?
The good thing is we can start in the same point because they are the exact same story. We're talking about the surviving child of Adeline Yvette Wilson Rigney, and we're talking about the department formerly known as Families SA, now known as the Child Protection Department. But for the purposes of this broadcast, they were at the time Families SA.
Yep.
That's how we'll continue to refer to them.
Yeah.
If you're an overseas listener or an interstate listener, knowing that they are now called the Department of Child Protection tells you everything you need to know. Our previous episodes have outlined the fact that 2 workers from Families SA were present at the Hillier farmhouse at the time of the murders, either just before or just after.
Yeah.
We know that Stephen Graham Pete told a psychologist that had they knocked on the door, he would have killed them as well. This would have been a 5-person rather than a 3-person murder. We have also heard throughout this investigative process that there was contact between Families SA and Yvette and her children, Amber and Corey, who were also murdered by Stephen Graham Pete.
Yeah.
In terms of the chronology, Daniel, I want to take a step slightly back.
Sure.
Last episode, we talked about the filing of an appeal against Pete's original 30-year non-parole period.
That's right.
That wasn't the only legal process that was going on at that time.
Okay.
In the background, separate to the court case, the state ombudsman, Wayne Lyons, decided to launch an inquiry.
Okay.
He wanted to investigate the dealings that had happened between Families SA and the Rigney family.
Right.
He wanted to know why the children had not been removed from that situation earlier,
Mm-hmm.
whether there was a way to have possibly spared them being there. You know and I know and our listeners know, Janet and Steve, the children's grandparents, were planning on taking them the very next day. That was a custody visit type thing.
That's right.
We also know that the surviving boy, whose name dropped out of circulation once
Yep.
a suppression order was put on his identity, was living with Janet and Steve.
Yeah.
So Mr. Lyons began his investigation. That went on as the appeal went on. The appeal came back in September of 2018.
Okay.
Fast forward 7 months, April of 2019,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll find Steve, Janet, and myself sitting in the Supreme Court,
Okay.
ready to fight the suppression order on the identity of the surviving child.
Now, just before we get too much further than that, we talked about this earlier. There was a suppression order put on for his identity, but not just his identity, just the fact that he even existed at this stage.
That's right. The suppression order was put down because, in the opinion of the Supreme Court, it would cause undue hardship to that child for his existence to be mentioned in conjunction with this absolutely horrific murder.
Yeah.
Now, looking at everything Steve and Janet went through, looking at everything Donna Rigney went through, there's a fair argument that that was a good call.
Absolutely, yeah.
But there's also the flip side of that.
Yeah.
And I want to say something here that I have said before on this broadcast. Imagine having your existence taken out of your family's pain.
Yep.
Imagine seeing your brother and your sister on the news night after night,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that in that photograph, just to the left, cropped out, is you.
Yeah.
Or worse, a blurred image.
Yep.
Someone's pixelated you.
Mm-hmm.
You're being erased from your own family's history.
Yep.
Prior to this day, in April 2019, Steve and Janet reached out to me.
Mm-hmm.
Hadn't heard from them for a long time. They said, we're going to the Adelaide Magistrates Court to fight a suppression order, and then we're going to the Supreme Court to fight a suppression order. Because we've been told that if the suppression order on our eldest grandchild's existence isn't lifted,
Yep.
the Ombudsman will not be able to publish his report.
Hang on. So, unless we can remove the suppression order on the eldest child who's still alive, the Ombudsman cannot release his report on Families SA's dealings with the family and overall.
That's right. If the
Okay.
suppression order remains in force,
Right.
Families SA will never be shown to have done what they did or what they didn't do.
Yeah.
Because you've got this bizarre intersection here
Yeah.
of the suppression order law
Yep.
with the protection of not the child in this case, but Families SA.
Sean, I'm going to be honest here. I wasn't necessarily expecting more twists and turns in this episode. That's another one yet again. This series has just delivered more and more and more unexpected elements that I had absolutely no concept were coming. I'll be honest with you. And this is just another one.
And it doesn't end there.
Right.
The reason Steve and Janet contacted me was because the DPP and Stephen Pete,
Yep.
through his lawyers, were opposing the lifting of those suppression orders.
Hang on. Hang on, Sean, hang on. So now, how does the DPP, okay, maybe. Sorry, how does Stephen Pete get mixed up in having anything to do with the identity of this child?
Isn't that an excellent question? Why is the person who murdered this child's mother, brother, and sister
Yeah.
given a Guernsey in a fight over his existence?
I am absolutely perplexed by this, Sean. I cannot understand this.
And I don't have an answer for you. It simply boils down to this. Well, the suppression order was made in his criminal prosecution, therefore he has a right to be heard.
I am exacerbated by that. I've got to be honest, because I don't understand how he's even in the conversation here.
And yet he is. So as a result,
Okay.
that means that the prosecutors that handled the trial, the defence counsel that handled the trial,
Yep.
all march back to the Adelaide Magistrates Court, and Steve and Janet say to me, Sean, we've been told if we want this suppression order lifted, We have to do it.
Sorry, it now falls to the grandparents of these children to have to go to court to... How does this work? I don't get this mechanism.
Well, the DPP, of course, is independent from government.
Sure.
But they're still a government department.
Okay.
Families SA probably doesn't want that report out there.
Okay, I understand that, yeah.
But the Ombudsman is somebody who investigates the government.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the Ombudsman wants this report lifted.
Yes.
But the Ombudsman doesn't have a lawyer to act for them.
Right.
The DPP is going to act in the best interests of the state government.
Right.
Families SA is part of the state government.
Okay.
So therefore, defence, of course, is going to act in the best interests of its client.
Yep.
So who's there to act for the best interests of the child? And for this report, the only people left on the list are Steve Egberts and Janet Wells.
Okay.
So now, this couple, who have been through hell, have to turn up to the Adelaide Magistrates Court first and then the Supreme Court, because there's two versions of this suppression order, one in each jurisdiction.
Okay.
You can't get one lifted without the other. If either of them remain, the Ombudsman's report is not going to be tabled, is not going to be made public, and Families SA are going to walk away.
So it's not even the fact that we need to get you to jump through one hoop. We're going to put two hoops there, and even if you jump through one, if you get stuck on the second one, it's still no go.
But we're also going to cut your legs off before you jump, or at least give you no shoes.
Okay. I am just, as I said, I'm perplexed, Sean. This is such an intersection, as you said, of different areas and concepts coming together. It's like Kerplunk, and we need to pull out all of these little... If anyone remembers, if you're my vintage, the old game, I'm sure we had it internationally as well, where you had the marbles in the canister and you had to pull out the skewers one by one, and you had to pull them all out until finally the marbles drop. We are pulling skewers here, hoping that we get the right marble and nothing else to drop here.
And if you've been wondering why this particular series on Just Lawful is so long, that's why. We still haven't hit the end of this yet, because more roadblocks, more skewers, that marble is just not going anywhere.
Sean, I'm gonna put this to you in a moment. We're gonna start to pull some more skewers because I don't know what marble's about to fall. Okay, Sean. So Steve and Janet have come to you and said they have to go to the Supreme Court, the Magistrates Court, and do this thing about a suppression order. What are they asking of you here?
They're basically asking me, what do we actually do? How do we fight a suppression order?
Yeah.
So I agreed I'd go along with them to both hearings and give them as much advice as I could.
Right.
On top of that, under the laws about suppression orders, the media has a right to be heard and the court has an obligation to listen to the media.
Right.
So I could be a second voice in support of Steve and Janet.
Okay.
They could come in and say, we want the suppression order lifted.
Yep.
Defence and prosecution are going to say whatever they're going to say, and I'm going to stand up as the media and say, well, we're on their side. We think it should be lifted as well.
Right, okay.
So we go to the Magistrates Court first. Now, this is a hearing that if anybody out there likes to trawl Google and look for my stories to read a bit more about what we talk about, you won't find this story because I couldn't write it because the suppression order in the Supreme Court still existed no matter what happened in the Magistrates Court.
Okay.
So we go to the Magistrates Court to what is effectively a hearing that doesn't exist.
Okay.
Steve stands up in court and says, we need the suppression order lifted. We want to publicise the outcome of the Ombudsman's report when it's ready. We're doing it now because it's going to be ready soon. Please help us.
Right.
The DPP says, we don't agree it's in the best interests of the child for this suppression order to be lifted. And to my undying rage, the lawyer who comes along on behalf of Stephen Graham Pete says, we agree with the prosecution. This child shouldn't be subjected to publicity.
So talk to me about that. You talked about rage there. Talk to me about that.
Very simply, where does a killer of two children and a defenseless woman get off deciding what's right for the surviving child? You have made this kid an orphan. You have robbed this kid of his family. Now you're going to say, oh no, he doesn't deserve to be named publicly. We're back again to Pete hiding.
Yeah.
Doing everything he can to duck under the radar. No more of this, oh yes, sentence me to whatever I deserve. I throw myself on the court's mercy. Now it's back to the good old-fashioned Steve and Pete of, I'm going to hide behind whatever legal shelter I can find. And, we don't want this report out there because it might say something about me, so hide. Use my surviving victim, effectively, as a human shield.
Yeah, right.
It's disgusting and disgraceful. And look, I stood up and pretty much said that. I said in court, we support, as the advertiser, Steve and Janet.
Mm-hmm.
There's a clear public interest in the Ombudsman's report being released. There are ways to not bring the surviving child fully into the story. We can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's actually let this report be published.
Right.
Thankfully, the Adelaide Magistrates Court went, yeah, fair. Mr. Egberts, you are correct. You've made a decision. You're the legal guardian of the child.
Mm-hmm.
We understand that you're going to adopt responsibility for whatever this happens,
Sure.
whatever this brings.
Yep.
Absolutely. Suppression order revoked. One down.
Okay.
So now we get back to where we started at the top of this episode in April 2019 when we go to the Supreme Court.
And what's the time frame between those two?
Late December-ish,
Yep.
2018 through to April 2019.
So it's not like it's it's certainly not the same day, but it's not like it's a week apart.
Oh, no.
You've got one down, but you still got them 4 months before you go to step up to do round 2.
Yeah, at least 4 months. It might have even been earlier than December.
Okay.
My memory is very late 2018.
Look, but whether it's 4 months,
but
5 months...
I don't have notes.
No, of course.
Because the hearing never happened.
It didn't exist, that's right. Whether it's 3 months, 6 months, whatever that is, it's not like we've got one out of the water, tomorrow we get the second one. We have got one, but we are still waiting here.
That's right.
Okay.
So we end up going back to the Supreme Court and we go before Justice Malcolm Blue.
Okay.
You'll remember Justice Blue, who handled the entire trial,
That's right.
was very big about public exposure. He was the one that released Stephen Pete's psychological report.
That's right.
Against the wishes of many people
Correct.
involved because he believed there was a legitimate public interest.
Sure.
I think that gave Steve and Janet some comfort.
Definitely.
They walked in believing that this was going to be okay. We've won at the magistrates' court level. We can win again at the Supreme Court level. It's going to be a fait accompli. Nothing about this case was a fait accompli.
Yeah, that's what I was afraid of.
So Steve came into court and he made some submissions and he said, we need the court to lift this suppression order to allow full disclosure of all the events that led up to the Hillier triple murder. He said the report's about to be released, but it won't be able to tell the full story unless the court lifts the final suppression order on the case. Then he said something that really struck home with me. We've always been misrepresented in this situation. We never asked for a suppression order, and we never agreed with the suppression order. Episodes ago, I said to you that we had to assume that the DPP was acting in the interests of victims
That's right.
and survivors.
That's right.
We saw every fight that Steve had with them. We saw, we don't address you through the media. We saw, we're going to send you a statement. We're going to ring you on a tram. We saw all of that. Here we are right back at that earliest point before I knew Steve and Janet.
Yeah.
And even back then, the DPP's doing things that the victims disagree with.
So were they consulted at that point? Is that what you're saying?
That's a really good question. Steve said, we've always been misrepresented. We never asked for it.
That's right.
We never agreed with it. Whether they were consulted, I'll be honest, I still don't know.
Sure.
But regardless, it wasn't something they wanted.
And it certainly wasn't something, as you said, even when it was imposed, wasn't something that Steve and Janet agreed to or thought was the right thing to do.
That's right. He said, this matter has become bigger than our story. It all needs to come out. The public needs to be aware of the implications for children in care and under investigation. We've already waited 3 years, and that's 3 years too long. We just want to make sure everything about this story comes out, because this suppression order has a huge relevance in terms of what happened to the children, in terms of families' SA. We have a huge obligation to these children. We fight to make sure every day that justice is done for them. And then the DPP spoke up. Prosecutors who attended on the day told the court they sympathise with the family's position, but it's difficult to see the public interest in lifting the order. And then they dropped the hammer. The Rigney family, Yvette's mother Donna, did not want the suppression lifted.
Okay. That's a different wrinkle.
It's a very different wrinkle.
Can I ask at this point? So, the DPP was in attendance for the first one at the magistrates' court as well.
They were.
First hearing. Are they presenting the same information, facts, the same case? Are they putting the same things forward they did at that point?
They absolutely are, because in their mind, the magistrate's court order doesn't really matter if you lose there. Because
Okay.
magistrate's court is lower than Supreme
Sure.
Court. Think of it like an umbrella.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you put the big Supreme Court umbrella up and the little magistrate's court umbrella under it, the rain's still not going to hit the magistrate's court umbrella.
Yeah.
So if you fold that umbrella, if you lose that fight, well, it doesn't matter. The
Sure.
big umbrella is still there.
Okay.
That's the one that they're really concerned about, and that's why they've dropped the hammer by bringing in the Rigneys.
That was my next question. So, the information about the Rigney family wanting that to stay in place, the suppression order not to be lifted.
Brand new.
Okay, so that wasn't presented at the magistrate's court
Not
the first
presented
time.
at the magistrate's
Right.
court. We might have had more of an argument on our hands at that point.
Well, I'm wondering, and we won't know, and this is conjecture, and I'll put that front. Did they have that information at that time, or once they lost the magistrates, the appeal in the magistrate's court, have they then gone and sought that as more information to use in the Supreme? And I said conjecture, and I get that.
Look, it is conjecture. It's how I've always felt, though.
Well, and look, that's where my mind immediately goes to. If you didn't use that the first time, yeah, you might not have been as invested in winning that one. You certainly wouldn't want to lose it, though. And if you did lose that, that certainly would have to play into your thought process of, we can't afford to lose the second one. That's the really important one. What other ammunition do we need?
So I thought the best thing that I could do was contact Donna.
Sure.
To write an article, first and foremost. That is still the job.
Yep.
I've been weirdly caught up in this. I'm doing something that is not really in my job description.
Yet again, Sean,
Again.
not in your job description. I was going to say, so it is nice that you say, at some point I've got to come back and write an article, because
That's right.
that is technically...
That's what they pay me for.
You're a journalist, that's right.
So I go back to that and I ring Donna. And this is the first conversation Donna and I have had since the day of the sentencing submissions, where she
Okay.
gave her victim impact
That's
statement.
right, yes.
And I said to her, look, Donna, when you and I spoke the day after, you said that you believed the children would have lived if Families SA had pulled its finger out and done its job.
That's right.
Those were your words to me. Do you still feel that way?
Yeah.
And she said, I still stand by that. But realistically, if a woman chooses to live with a man like Pete, what could Families SA have done? The blame doesn't go on Families SA. The blame goes on Pete. And bringing it all up now is detrimental to our family's health and well-being. We're still grieving, Yvette. Still grieving them all here at home. We don't want to hear it all being brought up. It's finished. It all happened 3 years ago. Why bring it up now? The victims should be allowed to rest in peace. They can't speak for themselves because they're not here. It's just really upsetting having all this going on.
And look, there is an element of that, Sean. I kind of have to empathise with that. I can understand that line of thinking, I'll be honest. So, yeah, look, I get that there is some element there of concern.
Especially when Yvette's character has been assassinated throughout this process.
And that's the other thing, and we said that early on, that, Donna, as a mother, wants to make sure that she can do something to protect that character. Because there has been attack on Yvette as a character as we've
She
gone
was
on.
blamed for her own murder.
Correct.
By her killer.
So I can understand that. I get that.
But to Steve's point, this is bigger now than
Correct.
Amber, Corey, and Yvette. This
Yeah.
is about systemic failure. This is
Right.
about a group that is supposed to protect children failing at what is in their name.
That's right. And I mean, as you said, it goes bigger than that, because now we're talking about the unfortunate situation that has happened. Is there any possibility, any chance whatsoever, that we can play a part in making sure this might never happen again? And if that's the case, the systemic sort of, I'm not saying competence, but the systemic sort of nature of this behaviour, how do we go about curtailing that? If this plays into that, then I can understand from Steve and Janet's perspective, that's a real balancing act there between the Rigneys and Steve and Janet at that point. Look, I can see both sides of this. I'm really fascinated to see where we go from here.
Daniel, I told you that the DPP brought the hammer down in the form of the Rigney family and their wishes about this sole remaining suppression order over the Hillier triple murder.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you've gleaned by now that Steve Egberts is no man's fool.
Mm.
And this is a man who will do whatever it takes, to the sacrifice of his own sanity and mental health if necessary, in order to look after the memories of his beloved grandchildren.
Absolutely, yeah.
If the DPP brought the hammer, Steve brought the broadsword. Because the submissions he made in the Supreme Court were some of the most powerful, insightful, and incisive commentary I've ever heard. This is a man with no legal background.
Yeah.
This is a man who has been abused, literally verbally abused, by prosecutors.
Yep.
Told not to whinge. Blamed for delays in his own dead grandchildren's trial.
Yeah.
And he rose above all that and addressed Justice Malcolm Blue. And he said, Your Honour, Families SA lied to us. They won our trust by falsely claiming they had intervened in the welfare of the eldest boy. We would never have trusted them to look after Amber and Corey if we'd known the truth.
Mm.
Child protection workers repeatedly told us they had acted upon a mandatory notification about the older boy, and we've since learned that they actually declined to intervene. So they told Steve and Janet,
Yeah.
We've had a report about the older boy. This is prior to the murders.
Yeah.
We've stepped in and we've looked at it. That was a lie.
Okay.
Steve and Janet were lied to.
Right.
He said, all we've wanted to do for years is let people know the truth. I can't believe that for 3 years I've had to fight to tell people what the truth is. Families SA continually lied to us about their intervention with the eldest boy. Had I known that, I would never have trusted them with Amber and Corey. He said, I'm responsible for the mistakes that I make.
Mm.
I don't understand why others seemingly aren't. I just want to hold Families SA accountable for what they did.
Look, totally understandable. I don't think there's anyone listening to this that wouldn't think the same. We are all held to our own account by our own actions and choices, good, bad, or otherwise, and we all make mistakes. I'm not saying that anyone's perfect or infallible. However, in this situation, this circumstance, I think he's got a right to be able to voice that and understand and let people know the systemic failures you mentioned of this situation.
And of course, the DPP's response to that was to go for the emotional. I've told you before that lawyers like to say victims are too emotional. They just, hang them high in Victoria Square. They don't know what they want. If we're up to them, everybody would be shot. So they came back saying, look, it's not in the best interests of the child. The child is going to suffer as a result of his identity being out there. It's important that the courts step in and protect the child from this. To which Steve replied, I am the child's sole remaining guardian.
Correct.
My son, as I told you in the victim impact statements, has been so distraught, so ruined by this tragedy, he's not capable of looking after his son anymore.
Mm.
I'm looking after my grandson now.
Yeah.
I'm raising my grandson now. Who is the DPP of all groups of people to tell me how to parent my grandchild?
Yeah.
He said, look, this is not and has never been about making a show pony out of the child. It is embarrassing having to defend our integrity when it comes to his welfare. People think these suppression orders are minimising his harm. There's no minimising his harm. He's lost his entire family. We've been to hell and back about this and we can't let it go. We just want him, Amber and Corey represented in the way that they should be. Families SA always portrayed to us they'd done us a favour by protecting the eldest boy, and this had a huge impact with how we dealt with them concerning Amber and Corey. We firmly believed that because they had helped, quote unquote, us with him, they'd help us with them. If we knew that they had declined to intervene, we would never have trusted them. This report, the Ombudsman's report, goes well beyond my grandchildren. We just want the truth. And it's been very hard coming here to court time and time again to fight for that truth. The Ombudsman's report, from what we've seen, because we've read it, is the closest we've got to that truth, and to showing that what happened to Amber and to Corey should never have happened.
Yeah, and you raised a point that you actually answered. I was just about to ask you. So at this stage, it sounds like Steve and Janet have read the report, and you just confirmed they had actually had an opportunity to read the report.
They had.
Because I was thinking as you were saying that, there's almost a situation of, is this just allegations that, families just say lied to us? Okay, that's Steve saying that, and quite a lawyer, you'd hope that that's all above board, and we know that. He's saying that, though, being able to say, I have also read this report. And the part that I'm really just fixating on a little bit here is there was a mandatory, what's the word? Sorry, mandatory notification that was given that Steve and Janet were advised had been acted upon, and yet it hadn't been acted upon. So right there, as you said, if they had known that, there's no way they would have put their faith extending beyond the eldest child.
You are told to trust the system.
Yep.
You are told it will look after the families in South Australia. You are told that it will protect children. Then it tells you, oh, actually, we didn't do that. And you don't find that out until after the children are dead.
Yeah.
You don't find it out in time to save them. You don't find it out in time to say, oh, mulligan. You don't find it out in time to say, that particular person there did the wrong thing, they'll be fired, disciplined, whatever. No. The ultimate consequence of this failure, of this lie, is that two children were left in a situation by their loving grandparents because their loving grandparents believed they were being looked after.
Yeah, agreed. Heartbreaking. It is that concept I talked about at the start of the show, the idea of something versus nothing, right? Because right there, you have said you have done something, and yet you've actually done nothing.
Fortunately, the court didn't do nothing.
That was my next point. What happens here?
Because Justice Malcolm Blue listened to all of this, and he said, I'm going to lift the suppression order. So after all this time, Steve Egberts finally beat the system.
And I think the other point that you raised there, and full credit, Steve, being the only guardian left here, shouldn't that onus come down to him of what is or isn't spoken about this child? So he finally gets a win.
That's right, and the win is very well pitched legally. The eldest child's existence can be mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
The report can be published.
Yep.
His name will remain suppressed.
Sure.
So we still will not be referring to the eldest child by name, even to this day.
Yeah.
He's not named in the report. He's referred to as Child C.
Yeah.
But the suppression being lifted meant that we could actually run photographs again of his pixelated image, still pixelated, but we could run it next to his brother and his sister.
Right.
So we ran one with my story on the lifting of the suppression order.
Yep.
Janet rang me the next morning.
Mm-hmm.
Happy tears. For the first time since I'd known her, happy tears. She said, my grandson saw his pixelated face next to his brother and sister.
Yeah.
I said, how did he feel? She said, oh, he felt amazing. He was so happy. And I said to him, are you upset that you're still, pixelated out? And he goes, nah, Nana, I'm just too cool for television. How lovely is that?
Absolutely.
Just, I'm too cool for that. They can't show me because I'm just too cool. He was back.
At least he now had the opportunity to exist with his siblings.
Just the gift of existence, and full credit to Justice Blue. It took a long time to get to that point.
Sure.
But he gave it the due consideration and came out with, I think, the human decision.
I don't think there'd be anyone disagreeing with that under these circumstances.
And that's, okay, suppression orders sometimes have their place in our system. I get that. I don't always like it, but I get it. This is one that had well since expired, long past its use by date, and was doing harm, not minimising harm.
Yep. Okay, so Sean, the suppression order has been lifted. That means that report can be released. If that's the case, what's the fallout when that report on Families to Say is released?
Let me read to you a few words from the report. At least 11 reports of alleged abuse or neglect were made about Corey or Amber in the years leading up to their murders. This included allegations that Yvette was abusing drugs, that Amber missed months of school and the family was forced to sleep overnight in a tent when they were rendered homeless. That there were missed opportunities to help the children because the agency was never truly satisfied that a full safety assessment was required. In total, 18 reports were made between August 2008 and the deaths of the family. At least 11 were mandatory notifications. None of them involved Stephen Graham Pete. All of them involved Yvette, Amber, and Corey. And this is the quote that chills me. The report paints a clear picture of disarray, substance abuse and neglect in the household, and nothing to indicate that the situation was likely to improve without intervention. And as we know, there was no intervention.
And I want to really quickly just say, I'm not going to pretend that doing that job on behalf of Families SA would be an easy job to do. It would absolutely be heartbreaking. Some of the things you have to see, report, do all of that, and I get that, and I'm not undermining or trying to diminish what that must be to have to do that role. However, we're talking about the concept here of 11 of those reports. That report alone being stated that it actually recognised that this was where and how they were living, yet they didn't have to do a full safety report or assessment on this, just means, again, nothing was done.
And it gets even worse than that. 18 total reports, 11 mandatory notifications, and in 6 specific cases of those reports, the Ombudsman found that they were dismissed by the agency as not necessary for intervention. He said, those 6 in particular should never have been dismissed, and I simply cannot understand why they were. Daniel, it won't surprise you to hear that the Ombudsman Wayne Lyons concluded that no reasonable person could have felt the children were not at risk based on all the information that the agency had, the agency being Families SA.
Yep.
It neglected or ignored a succession of opportunities to meaningfully assess the risks to which Amber and Corey were being exposed. He also said that it should have shared information with Steve and Janet. Now, that's putting it nicely, shared information, but that's his wording.
Yeah.
Instead, it prioritised considerations of privacy and confidentiality over the safety and well-being of the children. He said, people within Families SA, within the child protection system, may be tempted to emphasise their own responsibility to intervene in cases of suspected abuse or neglect, instead of sharing the information with relatives. That whole, we're the ones that can fix this, this is our responsibility.
Yeah.
But he said the reality is, by not sharing that information and by claiming that they're under-resourced or overworked, they're simply not actually acting on these reports.
Yeah, and you also, for me, you're depriving the opportunity there of those loved ones to be able to do anything of their own volition to maybe assist or help the situation.
Steve and Janet were supposed to have the children the day after the murders. I can't stress that fact enough.
A few moments ago, you mentioned that had they known that the eldest grandchild wasn't being looked after by Families in the manner they said they would never have left the younger two in that same capacity. That's what I mean. By not sharing the information, as we say, you take that opportunity away.
And we can't go into family court matters because that is completely banned. But I will say this. The fact that Steve and Janet had and continue to have custody of the eldest boy says everything about their qualities as parents.
Absolutely.
Everything about their abilities as caregivers and how good they are as people. Mr. Lyons concluded, Families SA, out of inertia or complacency or misplaced priorities, elected to do nothing rather than something. And that was wrong because Amber and Corey are gone, and those remaining have lost all faith in the system that was set up to protect them.
I'm struggling a little bit with that, Sean, because I think I totally understand where that sentiment comes from. And I echo back, as I said before, you're just denying those who are truly in need of help. And then when you have an agency which is stepping in to actually do it, and they're not actioning that again, it's just another failure there.
Another failure after a near-identical failure in the Chloe Valentine case that we talked about earlier in this series.
Yeah, well, I was going to touch on that in a little bit, Sean. You mentioned a number of episodes ago the similarities to this and the fact that that's why at the end of our very first episode, you didn't want to go into this case.
And it was the same thing all over again. It would just take years to actually come out.
Yeah.
And yes, Chloe Valentine died because of neglect and abuse.
Yeah.
Amber and Corey were murdered.
Yeah.
Different outcomes. But
Sure.
the pathway that could have saved each of those children from their fates was identical.
Well, the framework that was set or supposed to be set up to make sure that young, vulnerable children are protected is the same across both.
Exactly. Neither one of those two kids at Hillier nor Chloe should have died.
Yeah. So that report is out, but what does that do from there?
Well, the first thing that happens is that Families SA gets to make a response. By this point, Families SA no longer exists. It's now the Child Protection Department, and its boss at the time, Kathy Taylor, issued a statement. While the person who perpetrated this horrific act was not the subject of concerns raised with the department, the family was known, and we accept more could have been done to keep the children safe. No, don't look at me that way, Daniel. That's it.
Sorry, I was waiting for the next paragraph.
No, I could see that in your face. That's it.
So after this tragedy of these children and this woman losing her life, while Families SA has had interaction with this situation, and after all of that, to have this report come out to talk about the multiple opportunities that were overlooked, ignored, just turned a blind eye to, that's it. Underwhelming is far too extravagant a word to even give you any gravity of what I think of that statement to this situation.
It's absolutely maddening because that was the level of response that we got after Chloe Valentine died.
Where does this report live now, Sean?
Thankfully, the report lives exactly where it needs to live, and that's with the Office of the State Coroner. Now, the State Coroner doesn't just do what coroners do on TV. The coroner in South Australia has a court of their own. They can hold inquests. Coroner can't find anybody guilty or not guilty.
Sure.
What the coroner does is investigate reportable deaths. What's a reportable death? A reportable death is a death that could have been prevented. He takes all the evidence and comes back and says, here's how the death could have been prevented. Here's how the system needs to change in order to stop it happening again. The coroner will hand down findings with recommendations. Those recommendations pretty much need to be adopted by government. It's not a case where the government has to do it, but it's a very public document that if you don't lift your game and you don't do it, you're going to be looked at. Now, after the Chloe Valentine death, there was a coronial inquest.
Okay.
That's what I covered. The coroner came back with a massive list of recommendations of things that need to be changed. All of those recommendations predate Amber and Corey's murder.
So the recommendation, they were action to put in place?
Apparently.
Okay.
Because you've got to take the organisation's word for it. It led to the abolition of Families SA and the creation of the Child Protection Department.
Okay.
And what I'm thrilled to be able to say is, as recently revealed exclusively by the advertiser, there will be a coronial inquest into Families SA's handling of Yvette, Corey and Amber in the months, weeks and days prior to their deaths. That will be investigated.
We can't say how pleased we are to hear of that, obviously, Sean. I just want to ask you, now that we know that this is going to be the case, and you can guarantee we're going to be monitoring this and waiting to find out what happens, and as soon as the findings of this inquest come out, we will absolutely be looking at that. And I'll say now, we'll do a follow-up on this so we can let our listeners know what the findings of that situation, that inquest is, and what that might mean moving forward. But I've got a question for you, Sean. Doing this now, getting this inquest, having it happen after the Chloe Valentine, now this one, is this truly how we go about fixing things?
One of our listeners reached out on social media recently and asked, Sean, how would you fix the child protection system with all that you've seen in court, all that you've done, sitting through Chloe Valentine, sitting through the Hillier triple murder?
Yeah.
How would you fix it? I'm not the expert. I don't know.
Yeah.
One of the curses of being the journalist is that you hear all of this and you can be part of the promulgation of the amplification of the criticism. You can point out the problem.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily possessed of the tools to solve it.
Something, as you said, Sean, needs to change. Wherever those failures are, we want to find them, investigate them, uncover them, and do what we need to fix them. With all of that, every single twist, turn, unexpected event that you have thrown at us and the listeners throughout all of these episodes, we started out at a farmhouse at Hillier, where you received a phone call for a gruesome triple murder. You attended, and we covered your first 24 hours, which was an adventure ride all of its own, through piecing together information, through seeing a man come into court with two black eyes, not saying much, then coming back with a bombshell to say he'd only committed one murder of the adult and not the children. That's gone away. We've got lengthy delays. We've then got a suppression order which has removed the existence of a third child we don't know anything about. We've got prosecutors personally, verbally attacking grandparents of these children. We've got more delays. We've got mental incapacitation and automatonism. We've got that removed. We've finally got back to a point where instead of actually having to go through the trial, a man now says, I am guilty of all three. We have a 30-year sentence, which is then converted to a 36-year sentence on appeal. We then have the ability to go through and work out and remove suppression orders to bring back a child into existence, to have a report from Families SA to be released upon that suppression order being removed. We are now here at this point. Sean, have I missed anything?
No, you've pretty much done a very good job of encapsulating all that, and I'm wondering whether you're regretting doing this show with me now.
I'm not regretting it, Sean. Do you have any more twists or turns to drop on me at this stage?
No more twists and turns to drop on you, Daniel. But for our listeners, a very big and very important announcement. It's my absolute pleasure to say that from our next episode, we will be joined by Steve Egberts. Steve's going to come on the show and for the very first time, tell his story from beginning to end. Talk about Amber, talk about Corey, talk about Yvette, the entire situation that he and his family have lived through, and the justice that they're still hoping to achieve from this process.
That's always an amazing thing for me, Sean. You and I get to talk about it. We pull this apart. We dissect it. We give our, opinion, if you like, at times on this. You are much closer to Steve than I was. I am looking so forward to hearing the words from his own mouth, his experience. There is nothing like hearing the story from those affected. And we have done that in our previous series. We know just the impact this has had on himself, on Janet, and everyone that's involved in this story.
And especially in this particular case, not only is there nothing like it, there's nothing more important than giving a voice to someone like Steve.
Indeed it is, Sean. And with that, until we speak to you in our next episode, Sean, firstly to you, thank you so much again. Myself and the listeners truly appreciate you putting yourself back in this situation to go through all of this with us.
Thanks, Daniel.
For all of our listeners out there, as always, a massive thank you, whether you've listened to us on 5AA or you've heard the podcast on either iTunes or Spotify. We simply can't say thank you enough. We'd really, really love for you to go into those platforms, rate us, review us. 5 stars helps us immensely at the charts and gets that reach of us out to, as I called it a few weeks ago, the podosphere. If you want to get in contact with us, because we do truly value your feedback, your commentary, all of those things. We've had some wonderful commentary around this series and our last. Please, you can find us on Just Lawful Podcast on both Facebook and Instagram. At Just Lawful Pod is the Twitter handle as well. You can also get a hold of Sean and find out and follow him and all of the true crime stuff that's happening in Adelaide through his work with the Advertiser newspaper. That's, of course, at Sean Fuster on Facebook and Twitter. We are so looking forward to our upcoming interview, as we mentioned. Until then, though, as we always say, please enjoy our work, don't become our work, and we look forward to speaking to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.